Hi folks, in this video I'm going to talk about some comparisons between Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. Before we go any further, I want you to try to locate Nietzsche on this chart. So if you had to think of all the textual evidence and the things you know about Nietzsche's positive and negative philosophies, where would you locate him on these two dimensions that we've been using? Sources of meaning being social versus individual and religious versus natural. So pause your videos and try to locate Nietzsche here before we continue. Okay, I'm not going to tell you where Nietzsche goes here yet. What I want you to do is start constructing this understanding for yourself. So now I'm going to return to this. I'll tell you eventually, but not yet. Now I need you to answer another question. I want you to think about all the characters that we've encountered in so many different fictional settings. Which of these do you think would count as a Nietzschean hero, if any of them? Or which of these is most similar to the sorts of views defended or promulgated by Nietzsche? What resonances, connections can you think of between past films and the characters in those films and Nietzsche's own views? Now, this is really going to take some thought, so I do want you to pause your videos. Think of all these different films. What kind of connections can you draw between any of these characters and Nietzsche? Okay, that was your chance to pause your films. I really mean for you to try to build and construct this own understanding for yourself, because then you're going to remember it far longer than if I just tell you what I think about them. I think you could actually think that there's a lot of Nietzschean characters in these movies. There's connections between many of the different things Nietzsche says and these characters, but they could go with the good or the bad. This might depend upon whether you think Nietzsche is a monster or a saint, or whether you think Nietzsche's hero is somebody who we should laud and praise versus somebody we should despise. Because if you have a dim view of Nietzsche, you might actually see the kind of sadism and hatred of humanity that comes across in some of his quotes as similar to the things that Ivan says, who doesn't come off too favorably in Dostoevsky or Smirjakov or the Count Rugen in The Princess Bride, some of these despicable characters. On the other hand, if Nietzsche's positive view of the free spirit and the artist really resonates with you, then you might have seen something totally different. And maybe actually the man from Hiroshima is the most Nietzschean free spirit of all the folks that we've seen so far. So what I'm going to try to defend for you at the end of this video is that you could actually think of the man from Hiroshima as a free spirit if you did not buy my story that the man from Hiroshima is a Kierkegaardian knight of faith. So let's talk about Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, and then I'll come back to that defense. All right, I actually have a third question for you. So this is a super interactive video, apparently. You need to pause your videos now and think, what connections can you identify between Nietzsche and Kierkegaard? They are diametrically opposed, obviously. Kierkegaard's an arch-theist, and Nietzsche is an arch-atheist. But just looking at that superficial difference, I think, is terrible, because it's completely superficial. What we need to do is actually think more deeply about their views of the human condition, and we're going to see a lot of connections, despite the fact that there are also some deep differences that go far beneath the surface. So right now I want to focus on the connections. What things do you think Nietzsche and Kierkegaard would actually agree on? I want you to pause your videos and try to come up with a list. Okay, that was your chance to pause your videos. Now I'm going to give you my list. Here's one. So let's start at the beginning. Philosophy for both of them is deeply personal. Nietzsche, in the Gay Science preface, if you remember, the preface is all about him. He's talking about Herr Nietzsche's convalescence and recovery from a deep sickness, his new health, and the great joys that it's bringing him. And he even says things like, whether or not anyone, you can't possibly understand him if you haven't lived through similar experiences. And of course, this is completely Kierkegaardian. Kierkegaard says things incredibly similar to this. And in fact, in the Knight of Faith's quest for unconditional commitment, Kierkegaard is connected to and really defends the idea that this fundamentally creates a barrier to communication with others. It's really about one's lived experiences, and that makes every person indelibly unique. Kierkegaard even says radical things like, we can't even possibly understand other knights of faith, even if we are a knight of faith. So how deeply personal philosophy is for both of them is really an important connection. And I think that's connected to each of their existentialist views as well. Another thing is that humans are meaning machines. We are voraciously in search of meaning in our lives. And I think this really is driving both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. This comes across in so many different ways in Nietzsche. I just grabbed an example from the Gay Science passage 125 when he's talking about the death of God, but you see this all over the place in Nietzsche's writings. So, for example, in this passage, he says, how are we going to comfort ourselves? Because we need to comfort ourselves. That's what's the obvious implicit assumption behind this question. What festivals of atonement and sacred games are we going to have to invent? Because it's a given for Nietzsche that we do have this deep need for meaning. And if we're not getting it from God, from religion, then we're going to have to find it in somewhere else. Otherwise, we're going to just shrivel up and die. So to live without meaning is incomprehensible for humans, according to Nietzsche. And so if we're not getting that from a supernatural divine source, we better become value creators. This is his position. That's why he says, well, then we're going to have to become gods if we're not getting this significance from somewhere else. So humans are meaning hungry. It's a necessary condition of our existence in the world that our lives mean something to us. And this idea finds complete resonance in Kierkegaard. Here's one more example, because despite the fact that they disagree about Christianity, I mean, Nietzsche condemns it wildly and Kierkegaard defends it wildly. Nonetheless, there's actually a lot of deep connection between their critiques of Christianity. Kierkegaard is just as critical of traditional Christianity as Nietzsche is. In fact, the passage that I had you read from Nietzsche are from Nietzsche's work called The Antichrist. I mean, what more direct title could you get than that? And what's interesting, what the translators will note actually, is Nietzsche's title in the German is ambiguous. It could be translated as the Antichrist, or it could be translated as the anti-Christian. It's actually it's a pun. And I mean, Nietzsche is the king of puns. Wordplay is his forte. This is his professional specialization. And so I think he's precisely inviting this pun. For one thing, he's starting to identify himself as the Antichrist. So as an iconoclastic figure who is fighting against the church, because in some sense, the Antichrist is symbolically connected to Satan, and Nietzsche is aligning himself with that against the priest. This sounds like who would possibly want to compare themselves to Satan? But Nietzsche thinks this is actually the moral high ground, that traditional Christianity is condemn-worthy. But in that text, if you look at it carefully, there's nothing about Jesus in the text. And Nietzsche is careful not to actually call Jesus Christ in that text. So Nietzsche is attacking Christianity, but not the historical figure of Jesus. And he actually has all sorts of positive things to say about the historical figure of Jesus. So there is some more consonance between Nietzsche and Kierkegaard here. And after all, Kierkegaard wrote a book of his own called The Attack on Christendom. I mean, the similarity between this title and Nietzsche's is striking, since if we translate, if you think about what is the Christianity that Nietzsche is anti in his book, it is traditional Christianity, which he talks continually about the church. The church has destroyed and distorted the original meaning of Jesus's life, according to Nietzsche. And that is something that could have come right out of the mouth of Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard instead thinks, in order to get to the right relationship with God, we need to leave the church behind completely, which Nietzsche would be quite happy with. Now, Kierkegaard still puts it in terms of Christian symbols and says we need to come to the right relationship with God through these kind of unconditional commitments. So they depart out at a certain point here, and Nietzsche's positive story is going to have nothing to do with that. His concept of the artist or the free spirit is quite different. But nonetheless, I think there's a lot of connection between their rejections of traditional Christianity, and we would miss that if we just stay at the superficial level and think of them as the theist and the atheist with nothing in common. Okay, another one, number 4 on my list. They are both radical individualists. I mean, they are two of the most individualistic and champions of individualism in all of the history of philosophy. So for Kierkegaard, you have to come to an individual unconditional commitment, and nothing can mediate that for you. Not the ethical universal, so not your philosophical commitments, not the church, and not a traditional conception of religion. You have to figure out how to find meaning in your life through one of these unconditional commitments. Nietzsche says very similar things in the demand that we must become gods and value creators. And he talks about how, in general, people are incapable of doing this. And they both have this deep skepticism of their contemporary societies. So Kierkegaard's rejection of Christianity had much to do with rejection of his contemporary priests that he knew in the Danish church. Uh, and the people around his town, they were both deeply, uh, they were sort of ostracized in their societies. They felt very isolated from their societies. You know, Kierkegaard was actually continually lambasted in the press for being such a quirky, idiosyncratic goofball around Copenhagen. And Nietzsche as well. He had several very close friends, but he also, you know, had a difficult time in society in general. So they both have this deep outsider status, and this comes across as a kind of antipathy for the crowd. So Nietzsche talks about how, you know, the values that he's going to promulgate, this couldn't possibly be values for everybody in an ethical sense. The wish to universalize yourself is deeply problematic for him. He's going to create his truths, and it shouldn't be a truth for everybody, for the crowd, for the public. And Nietzsche has a lot of attacks on the herd and herd mentality. And so it's really interesting to read Kierkegaard and see things that could be word for word straight out of Nietzsche and Nietzsche's rejection of the herd. You know, Kierkegaard is lamenting the human condition by saying, you know, we're in despair if we're not reassured by being a part of the herd. This is, you know, our need for social affirmation and the others around us. Because Kierkegaard actually didn't get any of that social affirmation himself, he felt like the iconoclast and the person who was really deeply isolated. In fact, Kierkegaard said on his gravestone, what he wants etched in there is that individual. He's someone who really felt out of place in his contemporary society. Nietzsche, it's a deep thread of Nietzsche's philosophy that he is out of place in his society. He is a philosopher of the future. He writes, he says, not for any of his contemporaries. He writes for people to be read 100 years from now, because he just simply doesn't fit in the culture in which he was born. So this connection between their individualism and their philosophical views is really central. And this shows that it's not just a superficial connection, but this runs quite deep. Let me give you two more examples because my list is getting long. So I hope you can see here that there are actually many connections between Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. So the transcendence of the ethical was really interesting. It works out differently between the two of them. So I don't mean to say they have the exact same view, but remember, the title of Nietzsche's work is Beyond Good and Evil. And he says what we need to do is reject traditional Christian values and become value creators ourselves. We need to ditch the concepts of good and evil that we've been given, the ethical concepts of religion. And Kierkegaard himself says that we have to transcend the ethical and the ethical concepts of one's contemporary society and religion. So they both reject it. This is Kierkegaard's concept of the teleological suspension of the ethical, remember. And what's interesting is Nietzsche actually connects this very same idea with the concept of love. So look at this quote from Beyond Good and Evil 153. Whatever is done from love is done beyond good and evil. This almost sounds like Nietzsche gets the teleological suspension of the ethical from Kierkegaard. So this is a fascinating connection. Again, let me state, this is a case where I think if you look beneath the surface at a deeper level, they're not recommending transcending the ethical in the same way. So that in another video, I'm going to talk about some of the deeper differences between them. Because there's another half to the story. There's a lot of interesting connections, but we should not conflate Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, absolutely. So that's not going to be my final message. Another important connection, though, is remember Kierkegaard talks about asceticism and the ascetic ideal, and we have to reject it. We cannot just look for meaning in the afterlife. We have to redeem the earth. We have to, that's the night of resignation's way of being, is the ascetic way. The night of faith returns to the finite, the risk of the temporal. Well, this rejection of asceticism is huge and it figures immensely in Nietzsche's view, and him championing the earth. So you've seen many quotes from Nietzsche talking about the importance of the earth and saving the earth, returning to the earth, rejecting otherworldly hopes, and any philosophy that posits a beyond, whether it's religious or secular, is deeply problematic for him. And one way in which Nietzsche actually connects the temporal and the eternal together is his concept of the eternal recurrence. This is almost like a wonderful Kierkegaardian thought experiment. I think Kierkegaard would love Nietzsche's concept of the eternal recurrence, because this sort of highlights the paradox, how your temporal events, if they are the sort of thing that you could will infinitely to repeat over and over again, then you are, in a sense, are willing the temporal to have eternal significance. Nietzsche's almost come up with a way to reconcile the eternal and the temporal together in one of these Kierkegaardian paradoxes. I think Kierkegaard would love Nietzsche's concept of the eternal recurrence. Okay, so what that does, I think, is it helps us understand that that the character of the man from Hiroshima. So now I want to go back and defend something that I argued for at the beginning of this video. The character of the man from Hiroshima might actually be a Nietzschean hero, a Nietzschean free spirit. I said earlier that he was a knight of faith, but hopefully what I've convinced you of in this video is there's a lot of deep connection between Nietzsche's views and Kierkegaard's views. So it's not out of left field to think if he's not a Kierkegaardian hero, a knight of faith, maybe that's because he's a Nietzschean hero. There's so many similarities between Nietzsche and Kierkegaard that it's easy to maybe mistake the man from Hiroshima as one versus the other. So what was my previous argument about the man from Hiroshima? I argued that he had an unconditional commitment before, and that the atomic bomb was a symbol for the cataclysm in his life, and yet he was willing to return to the risk of finding significance in the temporal and develop a relationship with the woman from Nevers. So he is not a knight of resignation like she is. I think there's hands down she is a knight of resignation. And I think it's a little less clear in the movie. It's a little more ambiguous, purposefully ambiguous perhaps, whether the man from Hiroshima really counts as a Kierkegaardian knight of faith or not. But he's willing to keep going, to recreate meaning in the temporal, and not just be to stitch up the shirt of tears like her and live in the past and in the memories of the eternal memories of her past love. So I think he's got a certain characterization to him that makes him more of a knight of faith, or possibly a knight of faith. But I know a lot of people aren't convinced by that analysis that he shouldn't be a knight of faith. And what I want to argue here is, if you think that that's right, that he's not a knight of faith, then maybe that's because he's a Nietzschean free spirit. So what's the difference between these two? Well, the knight of faith for Kierkegaard, you might think, cannot survive the death of their unconditional commitment. Because if this commitment is truly identity defining for them, and then the object of their love or their relationship dies, is gone, then either that person has to die, or they have to become a knight of resignation because the object is not there anymore. So that's why, when she had her German lover, she might have been transcending the ethical, and she might have been a knight of faith. She had a life-defining relationship with him. But when he died, she either had to implode herself and just die, or she had to become a knight of resignation. And that knight of resignation, in a sense, was her way of saving her sanity. Remember those scenes of her in the cellar, and actually not dying. But it was only because she then could live in the past. She could not continue on and be a knight of faith. So if you thought the man cannot really be a knight of faith because he could not be a knight of faith and survive the death of his unconditional commitment, he's able to move on, then that is what the free spirit is. Nietzsche's free spirit is not somebody who has a dogmatic, unconditional commitment to something. The free spirit can, live with one source of meaning for a little while and then decide to reinterpret their lives and live in a different ways. At one point, Nietzsche says his artistic ideal, his person has brief habits. They're never stuck with one source of meaning very long and will shift from one to another. That really shows that the Nietzschean free spirit is quite different than the Kierkegaardian knight of faith. And maybe that means this is what the man from Hiroshima is. He's a deeply existential character. He's got all these commonalities between Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, but if you're uncomfortable with him as a knight of faith, maybe you're more comfortable with him in the Nietzschean guise. Okay, thanks.